Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Chocolate Life Live. My name is Clay Gordon. Today we're talking about learning how to teach chocolate making with my special guest, Josh Parker. We'll be back in just a short while after the intro video plays, and looking forward to everybody's involvement today in today's room. Well, good morning, Josh. Welcome to the Chocolate Life Live. How are you this morning?
I'm doing great.
Good. How are things you're in Idaho? I'm in New York City. How are things today with you?
They're going very well.
All right.
Glad
Glad
to
to
be
hear. So you and I have known each other for quite some time. You've been a member of the Chocolate Life. Our lives have crossed professionally over the course of the last decade or so. But we want to talk specifically about the fact that right now you are teaching a course on how to make chocolate virtually. So people can
Yes.
go to the internet and they can go subscribe to these classes. And so I wanted to go through how you learned to make chocolate, right? Number one, and then what you learned in the process of trying to teach chocolate making. And I think this will be really, really interesting for people, number one, who are thinking about the process of, I want to make chocolate at home, what's involved. But also, you know, there is a sense in which, the only way you know how much you know about something is to try to teach it to someone else. Right. So let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back. Where did you start off in terms of your culinary career, and where did you learn to start? Number one, what got you interested in making your own chocolate, and what did you need to do in order to learn to make chocolate?
Sure. Beginning, I started working in the food business professionally back in 2007. I was at Le Cordon Bleu in Portland, Oregon, and did not study baking or pastry or chocolate. But at the end of a pastry class, at the end of culinary school, there was a chocolate making video, and it intrigued me a lot. And so,
Just a video
just
on
a
it?
video.
Okay. All
I
right.
was one of those, sometimes you don't pay attention very well in class, but that one
Mhm.
stuck. That one had my attention.
Gotcha.
So fast forward a little bit, I started working in restaurants and found my way into the pastry kitchen. I just had that bent. And then
Mhm.
from there, even I noticed a lot of pastry chefs, some of them just didn't like working with chocolate. They said it was hard to work with. It was very fickle. I'm like, oh, if I figured chocolate out, there's my
Mhm.
niche in my career.
Okay.
So continued down that path for a few years. In 2014, my wife and family, we moved to Lubbock, Texas by that point.
Mhm.
And I have this, I've been making, chocolate truffles and whatnot, things using commercial chocolate. I thought, I really want to make chocolate. I
Mhm.
want to try my hand at this. No, I want to start a business, and I didn't want a restaurant. I didn't want a coffee shop. I wanted to work in chocolate.
Mhm.
And then the question was, do I make chocolate or do I buy chocolate and make products?
Mhm.
Both are good options, but I chose to make chocolate. So, but I didn't really still know what I was doing. So
Mhm.
I did a Google search. That's what most of us do.
Mhm.
Found the Chocolate Life, started reading.
Mhm.
Found a couple other chocolate makers that had posted videos on YouTube.
Mhm.
Found that I could buy cocoa beans, roast
Mhm.
them in my home oven, and then refine them. So I had to go onto Amazon, bought
Mhm.
a small, I don't remember what brand it was, refiner,
Mhm.
and kind of fiddled around for a little while.
Mhm.
First few batches weren't very good. Went into
Mhm.
brownies, but eventually I
There's
bought a little.
nothing. There's nothing wrong with brownies.
Oh no, no, no! It's a learning process,
So
and it was.
So, let's go back then. I mean, so I think that, when most people start the process of learning to make chocolate, it's very, very much, where you start, right? That you're intrigued by the notion of doing it. You, by this time, have probably purchased some small specialty craft chocolate, and you notice the difference between it and industrially produced chocolate. Even if by industrially we mean Valrhona, I mean well-known brands, and there's a
Right.
difference between that and craft chocolate.
Yes.
And you're going, okay, how hard could it be? Right. So you search around the internet, you find the Chocolate Life. You probably also find
I
chocolatealchemy.com.
did.
So John
Yes.
Nancy's
John
website,
Nancy was
right?
very
Um,
helpful.
Other places like the École Chocolat website. I don't know if they were teaching chocolate making classes at that point, right? But like many people, especially I think almost everybody, has to pay homage to John Nancy. I think he is
Yeah.
actually one of the most influential people in craft chocolate that doesn't get the recognition that he deserves, because I think that
I
almost
agree.
everybody who's in craft or specialty chocolate starts off with the production pathway that John identified, back
Yes.
in 2004, 2005. And so you're going, and you're experimenting at home. You have a day job, right? This is something you're doing on your own
It's just a
time,
hobby. Yeah.
right? And you've come out of Le Cordon Bleu in Portland 2007 or so,
Yes.
right? And it took another 7 years or so before,
Oh, yourself.
of experience working in kitchens, right?
Right.
Before you said, this is something I want to do.
Mm-hmm.
So how long did it take you from that first batch where you go, yeah, this is not very good, right, till you got to the point where you thought that this is something that I feel proud enough about that I want to sell to other people and I think they'll buy it?
Made my first batch in the fall of, I think it was fall of 2014. So the next spring, and I bought, I don't know, 30 kilos I bought way too many beans to start with. I shouldn't have, looking back, like that was crazy, but I was committed, I guess, and got to the point where I was proud of what I was making, and I was starting to figure out that it was I was using a Peruvian bean, and getting those raisin notes, and I was like, wow, this is interesting,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe I should get a booth at the farmers market. Let's try this out. Let's see if craft chocolate will sell in West Texas.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody. This is So I went to the farmers market meeting, and they're like, "You do what?
Mm-hmm.
This is all farmers mostly, a few craft folks." And I'm thinking it's going to be hot this summer. This is going to be interesting. But I bought my booth, or rented got my booth space.
Mm-hmm.
And I distinctly remember the first morning going and sitting at my little card table with my display and stuff on it to make it try to look professional. And that first bar, handing a bar to somebody and them handing me money for it, that moment I was like, it's this moment of, you feel proud, you feel excited, and this is real. This could work. Now, that's just the beginning, but it's enough to go, I like this and I want to pursue this. And I have a lot to learn, but here we go. And
so this is 2014 or thereabouts?
This was summer of 15 by this point.
Summer of 2015.
Yeah.
So as you think about the period of time when you are learning to make chocolate for yourself, for you personally, what do you think were the hardest things to understand and then the hardest things to master? Because I think that they might be different things.
They were. Honestly, I was pretty, I don't know, confident or cocky would be the better word, with tempering Valrhona chocolate on a granite slab. I could manually do that. I didn't need the machine, so I was pretty proud of that. Most kitchens don't have machines. There's your slab, go for it. So I'd had that down, I thought. Well, tempering craft chocolate was like trying to temper peanut butter to start with. So learning that how much cocoa butter to add. First off, do I add cocoa butter? You have to choose that one. Then how much? Because you have to be able to temper this stuff,
Mm-hmm.
or it's not going to work in a bar.
Mm-hmm.
I remember trying silly things like coconut butter instead. Coconut fat. Can I make that work? It doesn't work. Trust me.
Right. Right.
I
Well,
tested it.
you need to be very careful because
Mhm.
coconut oil tends to be liquid at room temperature. And so when you
Yes.
add it into chocolate, it gets in the way of the cocoa butter crystallization. And so in small amounts, right, you can make
Might
it
be wrong.
work. But what it does is it has the effect of making the chocolate quite soft. I mean, you don't get the nice snap, right? There are a lot of people who use coconut oil in their chocolate making, but they end up with a product that has to be refrigerated if
Yes.
it's going to be firm. And so so to some extent, understanding the dynamics of tempering and how this very, very practical aspect, if I'm making chocolate and I want to put it in a bar, what does my recipe look like?
Right.
Right. So do you think that that's a more challenging um, task for you, or do you think that understanding I have a cocoa bean, what do I need to do to roast it in order to be able to develop a specific flavor profile? So did you develop a philosophy of roasting, that this is an approach that you use?
I don't know if you want to call it a philosophy. Possibly.
Mhm.
I started being very careful with. I mean, coming from baking, you're careful with time and temperature, and
Mhm.
roasting, and figuring out where is that sweet spot that you develop the flavor right before you burn it. And I was using a still oven. This was not a convection oven, so
Mhm.
having to at what point do you pull it out, stir your beans, and put them back in. So just on a sheet pan, very different than using a convection oven or a drum roaster. But uh, finding out what worked best for that particular bean,
Mhm.
and then with that as the maybe step just a couple steps ahead here, as you change origin, you better take note because it's going to change. That
Mhm.
time and temperature will change.
Mhm.
And I've recently changed origins and burnt my first batch of beans because I was like, I didn't
Mhm.
I didn't take note of that. And you get that nice weird burnt peanut butter tasty chocolate. It's like,
Mhm.
whoops.
Right, which is good for brownies.
It is good for
Right.
nothing's
So, let's put this on the back burner because I think it's an
sure.
interesting question. So, or let's now, you come from a culinary background,
Yes.
right? So, but this is on the hot, salty side, not the
Yes.
sweet, not the sweet,
Right. Right.
dessert side.
Hmm.
And then you go into a kitchen environment,
Hmm.
and in many places, the concept of rework becomes really, really important, right?
Yes.
So as you're going into your chocolate making, how does this ethos? I mean, I'm not going to throw this away. I'm going to try to figure out something that I can do with it. I mean, do you find that that's something that was important to your learning, right? Or is it something that you felt, okay, I'm going to take this and it failed and I'm just going to throw it away?
No, I've thrown away very little chocolate. I've always found something to do with it.
Mhm.
I've worked at that point I'd been working in restaurants, but I'd
Mhm.
also spent a couple of years working in a candy factory. And so when you had toffee that was maybe a little bit too dark, you didn't necessarily throw it away. You broke it up and you would slowly put that portion that back into the next few batches so you didn't waste a 90-pound batch of toffee. So
Mhm.
the same thing with chocolate. I would use that normally for baking if it was a, a bad batch
Mhm.
of chocolate.
Mhm.
Um, but for me, there's times when you temper chocolate, you get it in the molds, you pull the molds out of the fridge and go, every one of these is
Mhm.
just a little bit off. You stop, you take a breath, you break it down, and you redo it. And
You remelt it and you retemper it.
remelt it. Yep, you remelt it and do it again and go. I was rushing it. And kind of review in your head. I was rushing the process. I was
Mhm.
distracted. What's the weather? I mean, that's one I know you've kind of
Mhm.
preached to me a few times. Be aware of the weather. Is it humid out today? Well, let's not get. Let's maybe it's best to stop. This isn't a good tempering day if it's really humid out. And you
Yeah.
have to just kind of come to that conclusion. Today is just not going to be that day, and
Mhm.
that's okay.
Mhm.
But learning those.
So So in that respect, I think if we can,
Sure.
what we can say is that, if I'm doing anything in pastry that involves dough, right, whether it's a yeasted dough or it's another kind of dough, and I think about things of hydration, right, the dough determines the pace at which it wants to work,
Yes.
right? And so,
Pay attention.
do you need to add a little more water? Do you need to add a little less water? Is it going to take an extra half hour to rise? Do you need, overnight hydration as opposed to something in the next couple of hours? You know, was that an important lesson? How important lesson was for you in your chocolate making?
It was. I mean, learning. For me, I think that as far as the speed at which the chocolate will, I guess we can answer this a few ways. The speed at which chocolate will refine sometimes changes depending on the environment. I've noticed sometimes working with the chocolate, you have to slow down
Mhm.
and pay attention to what it's doing. Is that when you're tempering on a granite slab, how cold is the slab? All of these little nuances that you may not notice when you're cooking something else.
Mhm.
When you're working with chocolate, you need to be aware of, and just start in some ways read the chocolate. What is it doing?
So again, you're sitting over a fire, you have a pan, and you're cooking a protein,
Right.
right? And you need to think about salting it or saucing it, right?
Mhm.
I get, I get the sense, if we can, is that there's a lot of leeway in there. I mean,
There is.
it's very much a la minute. Everything is in the moment in
Mhm.
terms of making the decisions. And actually, I think that sort of a la minute quality is part of what craft chocolate is about. I mean, if I were to think about the difference between a craft chocolate maker and an industrial chocolate maker,
Yes,
right? There's art in both of those things,
there is.
right? And the art has to do with recipe development. What am I trying to express? What is it that I want to make?
Right.
And that, at if we think of a spectrum in which industrial chocolate is one end and craft chocolate is the other, right? That at industrial chocolate, the art is in the beginning, right? Where I figure out how do I program the machines involved to make the chocolate, right? But in a craft chocolate perspective, my fingers are in it at every step of the way. And what I'm doing is I'm making creative decisions in the moment, right?
Yes, very
Do
much
I
so.
need to take it out of the melange now? Do I need to stop roasting? How is it that I'm going to be, am I going to add a little more sugar, a little less sugar? All of these things become, and I think that, I think is the fundamental difference, right?
Yes.
Between being a craft chocolate maker and an industrial chocolate maker. And you can, an industrial chocolate maker. So if I think of Felkland, they make some of their chocolates that sort of move towards the craft end, or Guittard, for example. And then
Mhm.
if you were to have a roaster, which is very heavily instrumented, so it's a drum roaster and you're connecting it to a computer and you have a bunch of thermocouples. So, you've moved the roasting process, up out of
Yes.
this way. So I think it's very, very interesting to make that distinction. And what I want to do is, for people who are watching, if you have questions for Josh or questions for me, comments, please type them into the chat or comment section of whatever platform you're watching on, whether it's Facebook or LinkedIn or YouTube. We can see them all here, and we'll be happy to get them up on screen and share them and answer them for you. Right, so, Josh, I'm going to jump forward and
Sure.
we're going to skip some things right now. So there's a lot of nuance and there's a lot of paying attention to detail. When you're doing a class in person, you have this opportunity to be able to interact and respond to things. But if you're doing something virtually, and what I'll do is, here is, the website for what it is that you're doing. How do you keep track of all of that stuff? How do you convey these? Because it is, the devil is in the details, right?
Very
And
much so.
how do you and getting people to understand the importance of these details. I mean, it's a challenge, I would imagine. And, as you're learning to make as you're learning to teach chocolate making, first you go into the in-person experience and then you move into the virtual experience. So what is the process of doing the in-person training, and how does it differ in terms of doing this virtually?
Well, like you said, in person is you can read the audience. What do they know this already? Are they getting it? Do we need to slow down a little bit? Do we need to reiterate? Do what I just say make any sense?
Mm-hmm.
Do we need to, rephrase that? And doing it in front of a camera, that was a very different experience. And so I had to stop and step back and really think through the steps and not gloss over anything, and make sure in making the video, there was, as you've seen, there's a lot of voiceover work that I had to go back and make sure that as I watched that, did I cover all the steps?
Mm-hmm.
Because there wasn't room necessarily for questions. I'm talking to a camera, or I'm talking to a microphone. And so trying to be as aware as possible,
Mm-hmm.
as the students watching this for the first time, and they've never made chocolate, or they've made it once and it didn't work right, what they did wrong.
Mm-hmm.
Can I convey what, the steps clearly, and help them to walk through those steps?
Right. So if you can, walk us through the process of script development. So what you've done is, you've created a process of going through. So we have step 1, step 2, step 3. Let me, what I want to do is I want to, so you've divided the curriculum into a number of steps.
Yes.
Right. Which is, first one of which is, what is this class going to be about? Right?
Exactly.
But then, bean selection, going through and trying to take what is, a complicated task, which takes years to learn. Well, it doesn't take years to learn. It takes years to become proficient at.
Yes.
Right. The steps that you've created here make an enormous amount of sense. Right. But the scripting process, I mean, how complicated was that for you? Going through and then you go, oh my gosh, I forgot this. And then you go and actually to the point of, oh, I'm on camera and I'm recording it, and, oh, I forgot something. Right. There's something here I need to talk about again.
At that point, I stopped and laughed and back into let's go back again. Right. But as far as script development, beforehand, I sat down at my desk and thought, let's try to write this thing out word for word.
Mm-hmm.
And that became very overwhelming. So I instead started just hit the big bullet points.
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, writing an outline, like you would do for any
Mm-hmm.
public speaking event.
Mm-hmm.
And then went back in and kind of filled in more details, but still tried to keep it not so. I try not to get into the weeds doing that, so that I made sure I hit the high points, but then could talk about. And I had that little piece of paper out on the counter next to me when we were videoing, so that I.
So you weren't reading off a teleprompter?
No.
Okay.
No teleprompters.
Okay.
That'd have been nice, but no teleprompters. No, I had a very patient camera crew that would sometimes just stop and in mid-sentence tell me to back up and say that whole thing again. So it really was just that. It was writing a good outline, making sure I had those, to the best of my ability, making sure I had those steps in place. And even after the filming, I realized there were pieces that I missed. So there was some voiceover work that we went and did after the fact. Because you watch it and the video is, video recording is done, and you're like, I totally missed that step or glossed over it too quickly. And to try to put bean selection, all of those details in one little short videos, I wouldn't say impossible. That wasn't, in some ways, I didn't try to go too deep into some of these things. There are some things that, go ahead.
No. I'm thinking about, the process of saying or thinking to ourselves, here are the key points, right? And it's really easy to get into the weeds and to overwhelm with detail. But if I think about, what are the most important points now, also, I have a question here is that were you thinking about each video, right, that you've got in the course here? We say we want to, no more than 5 minutes, right? And
Yes.
so you were writing, or at least you were producing to a certain length of time, and so we need to be able to convey the material within a certain point of time. How I mean, that sounds like a laborious process. I mean, for me, one of the great things about, the Chocolate Life and being social media, right, is that if I need to write to 3,000 words, I can write to 3,000 words. But if I only want to write 1,000, I can, right? But the idea of is like, okay, everything is going to be 5 minutes exactly, right? I need to script to 5 minutes exactly. I mean, how do I go about doing that? That sounds like a really, really crazy kind of process.
It was, the film team, they had the Argos Productions in Boise was the team that helped me. And again, a very patient crew. They had the same outline in front of them. So they knew, okay, we've been talking about this section for a long time. I've got a lot of great content here. And they would ask, do you think have you filled all the points in? Because they're not chocolate makers, but they're great videographers. So, and I would go, no, hang on, let's do this one more piece, this little piece here, so that, okay, I think we're good now. Right. You go to the next step.
Right. So having a camera crew that were not subject matter experts. Yes. So they had no assumptions. I mean, they didn't know what was going on, and they could go, that doesn't make sense to me. Could you talk about that again? I'm imagining the camera crew.
They did that.
Okay.
Right. Yes. No, they did. They're both of them are both foodies. So they this wasn't just shooting the video for a job. They were genuinely interested in what we were what we were talking about. So that kind of made it fun. There was dialogue as we're shooting, and then of course they edited their stuff out. But it kept me going. And oh yeah, that does need to be worded differently, or
So when you started doing your classes in person, was it one class and you went from the start to the end, right?
We did.
Yep. Right. Is that easier? I mean, is doing this right online harder or easier, right, than doing these things in person?
In person was far easier. Because I could stage, I would stage parts of the process. No, there's, students not going to come in and roast the beans and stand there and wait for 10 minutes.
Well, how long were these classes?
They would run about 2 hours.
Okay.
So, they would, and depending on how big the class was, I would do no more than 6 students at a time. 6 students to me that was a lot. To make it worth their while. This wasn't a lecture series. This was an interactive. You're going to put gloves on and roast some beans, and you're going to temper something if you really want to. And so, I would we'd roast. We'd start a roast process. We wouldn't stop there and wait 15, 20 minutes, depending on the roast time. We wouldn't sit there and watch the oven. We'd start that, and I would take some beans that were roasted. We would break them in our hands, taste them, talk about them. We would winnow those. We would take those. I mean, that's a pretty quick process. From there, we would scale out a batch, nibs, sugar, and cocoa butter, and go to the refiner when we start the process. That batch, of course, wasn't going to be ready for a couple of days. So then I had chocolate ready. We would temper. I would demonstrate the melting and tempering process. I would make a bar, pop that in the fridge. And then those that wanted to try tempering could. Some, of course, some don't. One of my favorite classes, though, it was I had 2 couples bail on me. So it was just me and a couple. And it was honestly, it's a lot of fun. They got to go at their pace. And they were very interested in the tempering process. So we spent most of the class in tempering.
Right.
It was fun.
So I remember the first in-person classes that I ever co-led. And actually there's a Belize connection there because it was Jeff Pazina, who's one of the co-founders of Cotton Tree Lodge down in Punta Gorda. He and I were giving classes in East Harlem, and this is 2005, 2006 or thereabouts. I mean, it's quite a while ago, and I can't imagine trying to cover this information in 2 hours. I mean, so we did an all-day class. I mean, we started at 9, we ran to 5, we took an hour lunch break. And what we had done is we had staged things in the refiner.
Right.
You know, otherwise we did everything. So we did the roasting, the cracking, the winnowing, running things through a champion juicer to get liquor, putting, pre-refining the sugar in a Cuisinart, putting everything into one refiner, and saying it's going to take 24 to 48 hours for this to be done.
Right. Yeah,
then pulling out another refiner and saying, here we are. Here's the swap out. Right.
Yes.
How do we go about doing that? I can't, and spending 8 or 9 hours, doing it, going around the corner to Patsy's Pizza for lunch while we're waiting for things. Trying to make a day of it,
right.
When I ran, I've done other kinds of classes, and I just can't imagine trying to do this in 2 hours. I mean, the amount of work that needs to get done in terms of swaps, right, and planning and things like that, and trying to convey all this information in a couple of hours. Thomas, you asked the questions, were these classes taught in Belize? And so I think, Josh, this might be directed at you. These classes that you were teaching in person, were they in Lubbock? Are they in Boise? Are they in both places? They're in Boise.
I taught chocolate. Yeah, the live classes were in Boise.
Okay. So this is after you've come back from Belize,
yes,
right, and setting up Mahogany Chocolate down on Ambergris Key.
Yes.
So Keith asked the question, does unrefined cane sugar work differently than refined cane sugar? Sugar made from sugar beets, right? And the course intro, ordinary equipment. Are we using a hair dryer, making chocolate with Revlon versus Schick? Very cool. So let's focus on the ingredient question first. All right.
Sure.
And let's focus on, I think there are 2 different ways in which we can think about this, right? And one of which is a workability question. So when we think about unrefined and refined cane sugar in terms of their technical characteristics, is there a difference between the two? And that's different from work, is that would unrefined cane sugar as opposed to refined cane sugar, will it taste different? Right. And I think that those are 2 different questions. So if what you want to do is you want to talk about the workability question, I mean, do they behave differently in a refiner when you're making chocolate?
I use an unrefined cane sugar. It's personal preference. I've tried unrefined.
From a flavor perspective, I mean,
to me, the flavor to me, there's a slight difference in flavor, and so that's kind of become my standard chocolate, or excuse me, my standard sugar. I've used refined just because I wanted to try it. I mean, to pick one and go, that's it, no changes. That's kind of silly. But I tried refined. I've tried beet sugar, and personally, beet sugar is my least favorite for flavor. That's just, again, personal preference. Not to say others shouldn't try that, but there's a flavor profile that you're looking for when you're making chocolate, and the one I was looking for that I liked the most was an unrefined cane sugar. It's a larger grain, so I would certainly recommend, if you have a food processor, grind that beforehand. Makes it easier to load and easier to refine than big chunks of unrefined cane sugar.
So I mean, one way to think about this is that beet sugar tends to have a more neutral flavor, right? And so it's more about the sweetness, right? But if I were to think about an unrefined or a refined white sugar, whether it comes from cane juice or whether it comes from beet, you'd have to be really, really sensitive in order to be able to tell the differences between those two in a bar of chocolate, right? Whereas unrefined sugar, and you get different levels of unrefinement, right? So it's an evaporated cane juice, which is, And when they say unrefined, I believe, right, it's that it's not filtered, right? And so, or not filtered as much. And so what you're getting is you're getting some minerals and some other things which are in the sugar, which influence flavor.
The flavor, right?
Right. Okay. Um, have you experimented with the idea of mixing different sugars, where I might make 80% unrefined sugar and
Mhm.
20% refined sugar? I mean, I'm fascinated because when we think about single origin, we think about blends and things like that. Almost all of the focus is on cocoa beans,
It
and
is.
not the focus is on other ingredients, right? So
Right.
can we change the kind of sugar, the origin of sugar? Can we blend sugar? What can we do? And use the same cocoa beans and just have different products at the other end.
Mhm. Certainly you can blend
Mhm.
sugar. That's something I have not done. I've blended beans, different
Mhm.
origins. Um, should
Mhm.
change your flavor profile. I've taken the same um, bean and
Mhm.
changed the roast profile,
Mhm.
smoked it, as we've talked about. Different options with that. But I personally have not um, experimented very much with blending sugars or blending sweeteners.
Mhm.
I've made sugar with. I do make a monk fruit sweetened dark
Right.
chocolate. I have somebody asking for a sugar-free
So
dark
for a
chocolate.
sugar-free dark chocolate, yeah.
Right. It's not, my personal favorite. That's
Mhm.
okay. It doesn't have
Yeah.
to be. Um, but somebody wants it, and so. But there's, I've tried stevia and other sweeteners,
Mhm.
but my go-to is
Mhm.
unrefined cane sugar.
Well, I mean that brings an interesting point, because at some point when you make the move between I am making chocolate just for myself
Right.
to I'm making chocolate for
Mhm.
sale, right? This is the point in which the question of it may not be my personal favorite, but I know my customers are going to ask for it, so I'm going to make it anyway.
Exactly.
And so that talks about, you know, what is the source of inspiration for, um, you know, recipe, creation, right? So you're sitting there and you're going, well, what am I going to change this time? Where does the inspiration come from in terms of trying new things?
A lot of places. It's
Mhm.
been depending on the chocolate. For example,
Mhm.
I had one product called Java dark chocolate, and every year, that's a 64% dark chocolate
Mhm.
with coffee refined into it.
Mhm.
So every year, the last several years, I excuse me, I've changed both the cocoa and the coffee, playing with different things. Just kind of this past year, I used a Vietnamese cocoa, for example, and a
Mhm.
Sumatra coffee. I wanted to make it more of an Asian, if you will,
Mhm.
chocolate. So I think looking at the end products you want to have,
Mhm.
how do I get there?
Mhm.
Um,
Mhm.
sometimes that's it. Sometimes it's for me. It's what do my customers want? I'm doing a lavender fest. Guess what's going to be in my chocolate? Lavender.
I'm guessing lavender. Mhm.
Again, not my personal favorite, but working with local lavender farmers in the area
Mhm.
here, I found a one of them makes a lavender oil that I put very sparingly, because that stuff is strong,
Mhm.
in dark chocolate,
Mhm.
and um, people love it. So it
Mhm.
depends on. I guess you have inspiration from different areas. If I'm trying to sell
Mhm.
to those folks,
Mhm.
that's what I'm going to be working with.
So going back to see, for me, I mean,
Mhm,
one of the I think sort of like the seminal conversations I had around this topic
mhm.
was with Jacques Therese, and was back in 2007, around the release of my book,
Okay.
right? And we were talking about it, and he said, you know, I can teach anybody technique, right?
Mhm.
So learning the basics of how to go do this, and what do you need to do in order to make something. Teach anybody technique, um, but I can't teach anybody taste, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah, and so for me, the mechanics of making chocolate. I mean, there may be no wrong way to make chocolate. There are lots of different ways to make it,
Mhm.
right? But it is all about for me, it is all about um, recognizing what you like,
Mm-hmm.
right, and what you don't like, right,
Yes.
and then being conscious of what it is that you're doing, and then moving forward, and
Yes.
trying to realize that. And it's really, really difficult, I have found, to teach people to be creative around the idea of taste and experimentation. I mean, have you found that? I mean, in your own work for yourself, and as you go through doing these classes, I mean, is how important, or how does it, how is it a theme that you run through? Is it an impediment in terms of giving them the classes?
As far as the flavor, um, they've used different chocolate in different classes, of course,
Mhm.
but we'll taste a couple. Done, finished chocolate. We'll have a little
Mhm.
tasting of just chocolate bars.
Mhm.
And so before I give my people, what do you taste, Josh? It doesn't matter what I taste. What do you taste?
Mhm.
I have my opinion,
Mhm.
and I'll certainly share that with you after you taste it. And you think for a minute,
Mhm.
and there's no wrong answer.
Mhm.
Um, so I think that's been fun, and then allowing them to taste the same chocolate out of the refiner versus aged. That's a whole another topic, I know.
Mhm.
Aging chocolate, um, and the differences between those two, and how the temperature and how the texture um, changes, even though
Mhm.
it's the exact same lot of beans that's in
Mhm.
those two chocolates. So that is a subject that can certainly that would take the 9 or 10 hour class. The 2 hour we didn't go into it in
Wow.
that much detail.
Right. Right.
So,
Yeah, in a 9 or 10 hour class, you can introduce the concept. I mean, but for
yes,
me, again, bringing it back personally,
sure.
I was lucky enough to take a class from Albert Adria, who's the younger
Okay.
brother of Ferran Adria, who's the founder of El Bulli, right? And Albert, says, he didn't provide recipes for his class, right? Because he didn't want the people in the class to copy what it is that he was doing, right? He wanted to say, okay, how do you go and come up with your own ideas for how you go about doing this? I mean,
Mhm.
again, technique aside, the notion of how to decide, you know, what ingredients you're going to use and how to put them together. And another anecdote. When I grew up, my mother was an excellent cook, but not, I would say, a chef. Right. So she was really good at following recipes, but really bad at improvisation. And so she wouldn't actually think to change a recipe until she'd done something 8 or 9 times and was exactly, she knew what it is that she was doing, all right, before she got into it. And I find that for me, that's one of the hardest things to teach is or hardest things to get across to people is like, so for example, I hear, what it is you're talking about, Vietnamese cocoa beans and Sumatran coffee, right? And understanding, you know, if it's a wet processed coffee, it's going to be dark and muddy, and when it's roasted. But I'm also thinking, oh man, I mean, the roast of the coffee bean that I'm going to incorporate into this is really, really important. And then I'm going, oh man, am I refining the coffee bean in, which will give me one textural and flavor experience, or
Mhm.
could I grind the coffee to like an espresso roast and put it in as an inclusion?
Right.
And for me, it's this notion of playfulness. That you have to know the rules before you can break them.
Yes.
And is this something? Are these kinds of conversations the kinds of conversations that come up in your live classes? I mean, I don't know how many people have subscribed to your online course, and I know that you offer a private Facebook group for the
Yes.
people who take the classes so people can ask these questions afterwards. But in your experience, are people more concerned with learning the technique, right? Or are they more concerned with sort of the creative, playful recipe kinds of ideas?
I think so far
Mhm.
it's been learning the technique,
Mhm.
and I do reiterate, depending on how they're acting, and they're acting in a live class.
Mhm.
Um, I like to stop and remind folks that yes, you're going to walk away with a formula. I'm going to give you this little pamphlet that you're going to walk away with this information. But just like in cooking, this is a guideline, or this is a way to do it. It's not the only way. Um, there is certainly, once you understand the basics of how chocolate works or how to make a brownie, then you can play with it.
Right, but I think about the physics and chemistry of baking,
Mm-hmm.
right, and ratios and things like that in baking.
Some things can't change, but
some
can.
things can't change and some things can, right? And with chocolate, in some respects, there are, in many respects, there are many more variables, right? And in some respects, there are far fewer variables, and so the creative challenges become very, very different in doing those things. So again, in thinking about the process of learning how to teach, right? What was the hardest? So how did the hardest lesson for you to learn in your own chocolate making learning, your own journey, how did that translate into how you approach teaching those things in both live classes and online?
I think in live classes, this is not something I did in the video series, but in the live classes, I have no problem talking about my mistakes. This is where I messed up here. This is where I messed up over here. Just in some ways to take the edge off. Some folks, I think, come in there, frankly, they're just nervous. And this is a fun class. Let's not be nervous. So
it's just chocolate. Okay.
It's just chocolate.
It's just chocolate.
Promise.
It's just chocolate.
It's chocolate. Okay. No, but it was in talking about roasting and in what's going on as we're roasting and why we're roasting and what you need to be aware of so that you don't ruin the bean. You develop the bean. You kill the bacteria, but you don't burn the beans. That for me was a harder part. So how to share that without it being boring. Trying to make it a little bit, in some ways, I don't know, joke about it a little bit, talking about some mistakes.
Do you in a 2-hour class, do you have people whose attentions wander? Right. And I mean, they're there, they've paid to be there. Are they really, right?
Not
this is
really.
boring. Okay.
I don't think so, but I don't want to. Sometimes I notice some that I just think that aren't, I don't know, maybe they're nervous of what, trying to read them. Are you nervous? Are you bored? What's going on here? But talking about the process without belaboring it too much and going, this is an area that you can manipulate, you can change. And I'll talk about a Haitian cocoa bean to me is one of the most pliable beans. You can light roast it, or you can really crank the heat up on that and not burn it. You can if you go too long, of course. But
what's interesting, but it's the same island with the Dominican Republic. Do you have the same experience with beans from the DR, or is it just beans from Haiti?
I've burnt DR beans. I've never burned a Haitian bean yet. Okay. But it's a bean that I've found, and I'll talk about it. This is a bean that's good for light, good for dark. It takes to smoke very well. It's the bean that I use to make a smoked dark chocolate. Versus, I said, a Belizean bean, the differences in that, and the flavor profile, and some of the roasting differences. And just to let them know, you can play with this. There's room to experiment. That's the fun part. But you're making chocolate for yourself. Nobody has to know that something didn't go right. It's in your kitchen. It's like making cookies. This is for fun.
Right. And if you don't like eating it straight, you can always put it into a brownie or a cake or ice cream or something.
Exactly. Right. There's so many things you can do with the chocolate. And some folks have, the couple that I ended up, it was just almost a 2-on-1. It was a lot of fun. We talked about savory applications for chocolate and sauces that you can go into. And I told them, they asked for recipes. I said, off the top of my head, I can't give you one. I don't have one on the top of my head. But I gave them the name of a book that I've used to make different savory recipes with chocolate, experimenting with it. Great for pork and whatnot. So, for a home application, chocolate is learning to make chocolate. I think is almost this extension of, I love to bake at home. I love to cook at home. Let's up the ante a little bit. Let's make our own chocolate.
Gotcha. I want to remind people who are watching that we're heading into the home stretch, the last 10 minutes of today's interview. And if you are watching on YouTube or on Facebook or on LinkedIn, if you put a question or a comment into the chat box in the application, we can see it here, and we can put it up on the screen, and we can get it asked and answered for you today. I also want to remind people that if they are, especially if they're on YouTube, to subscribe to the Chocolate Wire channel, to like the video, to share it with others, comment, subscribe, do all of those things. It supports me, just in wanting to do these things on a regular basis. And of course, YouTube algorithms, YouTube God's algo and rhythm will reward. And as the channel grows and there are more subscribers, there are more things that I can do with everybody. So Keith, thank you very much. He's come in, and Josh, he's asking for, what is the name of the book that you said that you liked that had chocolate recipes that you share?
Let me grab it real quick. Is that all right?
Sure, go ahead. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the great thing about the internet is, you can go off camera and it's fine. It's fine. Absolutely. Keith, I mean, the thing that I have learned about this is that if you think about chocolate as a way of adding depth and complexity, you can use it in whether it's cocoa powder or chocolate or cocoa butter. You can use it in lots of different ways. So for example, I think about gumbo filet, and the filet part is ground sassafras root. And what the sassafras does is it provides a bottom, sort of an earthy roundness and fullness to it, but you don't necessarily taste the sassafras. It's there to sort of like salt in a particular kind of way. So why not use chocolate, right? Right, when you have the opportunity is something I think about. But so Josh, you have the book and you wanted to share that book.
Cooking with Chocolate. The author is Anavir Laskin. And so you can see it there.
Okay. So what I will do is either in the comments after this is over, right, or in the actual or in the description for this, what I will do is I will put a link to that book, right,
yes,
if people are interested in going and learning more about it. So in looking at that, in looking at cooking with chocolate, I mean, what do you think that the number one lesson or the thing that surprised you most in terms of opening up your creative opportunities, right? Or you're thinking about this, and are you applying any of those lessons to savory cooking or just savory cooking, or does it come in and inform the chocolate bars that you're producing?
It goes both ways. I like adding spice to my chocolate. I've started playing with other inclusions like that, black peppers and things that some would just say that's a savory spice. Why would you put that in chocolate? But it can bring out different notes that are already there in the cocoa. Smoking it, so to me that's a savory thing you do. You don't smoke sweet things, but you can. And so playing back and forth with those flavor, those techniques, those ingredients. I like taking a recipe, whether if you're baking or savory, I like to take a recipe in some ways, strip it down to the bare minimum, and then build it back the way I want it. So with cakes, I do a flourless chocolate cake, and to take everything out off the recipe that's not necessary and build it back. And then these are the 3 or 4 things I can play with depending on the cocoa or depending on the chocolate and what do I want to bring out. So I guess just allowing yourself to experiment and not be so stuck on.
Well, allowing yourself to experiment, how is that the same as, or is it different from allowing yourself to make mistakes?
It's both. Same thing.
Okay.
Because to me, experimenting, you're going to go, that was bad. That didn't work. But, or it was, But to me, I think that's part of it that keeps it exciting. If not, going in and doing the same thing every day is really boring. And part of the fun parts about making chocolate or baking is that, well, depending on the origin of the cocoa, you can really change it. Same formula can be very different. Or it's the same cocoa doing changing your roast profile, changing your refining time, can totally change the chocolate. And so experimenting with that and knowing that you're going to make mistakes is part of it, and to not belittle yourself.
Right. So Thomas is asking a question about roasting, and so I'm going to let you read it, and I'm going to say one of the things that I found is that if you start off experimenting and roasting expensive beans, right, you are sort of putting you're saying, I don't want to ruin these beans, and so you're not going to push the boundaries of roasting, right? Because if you over roast them, they're expensive beans to waste.
Yes.
And so, for example, I always counsel starting off on a lesser expensive pressed West African bean, right? Because if you make a mistake, it's not going to cost you all that much. So Thomas asked the question: during the roast, are you tasting the beans after you start smelling the brownie smell, or how does it work for you? And specifically when you use a bean for the first time.
I do. I start. I know. I put them on for generally it's 10 minutes when I'm using a convection oven. That's normally what I use is a convection oven. And so 10 minutes is everything needs that much. And then that's when I start really paying attention. I pull them out. I'll crack one in my hand, and generally it's obviously it needs longer than that. And I roast at 275. That's for me. It's
275 Fahrenheit.
Fahrenheit, yes. Okay. Yes. That's my good point. That's my constant temperature, just so then I play with time. My temperature didn't change. I'll crack one in my hand. I will taste it. Generally, it's going to need longer than that. So there's some give and take there. To give an exact answer, I think it's a tasting it, a feel on my on my palate too. Does it have any crunch? It's still going to be pretty moist because it's hot, but I don't start roasting it a lot. I'll roast a small amount and taste it and refine that if I'm not sure.
So just a real quick question that I have before we get to the next one.
Sure.
How long did it take you to get to the point where you felt confident that when you were tasting beans during roasting, that you were making good decisions about the roast?
That took a while. The confident part did.
Right.
I started just going off of I made the first few batches. The first one, again, not the best, but then I got to a spot. Okay, if I just go by the timer, we're good. We know the timer says this, the temperature thermometer says that. Using the same bean, it worked last time. I'll go with that again. Then it came down, okay, if I'm going to change origins, which obviously I need to do.
Right. That leads us into the next question from Mark and Yuri at Blue Spruce in Colorado. How do you evaluate a new bean in an economical manner?
I roast small batches. I'll a kilo. I don't fill a full sheet pan and fill the oven up and because that's not necessary.
Well, let's ask that question very briefly. I mean, one of the things that I know about a good commercial convection oven, right, is if you put one pan in it, it will behave the same as if you put it, fill it up with 6 or 10 pans, whatever the capacity is, as opposed to a drum roaster. I mean, if you have a 10-kilo drum roaster, if you put a 1 kilo in it as opposed to 10 kilos in it, it's completely different.
You're going to burn. Yeah.
Well, it's just going to be different. No matter what's going to happen. And so, so one way to think about it is in an economical manner is, what it is that you're using as a roaster, what technology you're using as a roaster factors into that. And I suppose the answer to the question, if I can answer it, is that what is the smallest amount of cocoa you can roast so that if you change the quantity of cocoa, right, that there won't be any significant differences in the process, right? And that changes. If I'm working with a convection oven, then it may be that I can do very, very small quantities in this large convection oven. And if I If I change the quantity, I get no difference. But if I'm using could I go from a small 1 kilo like Be More drum roaster and then go to a 25 kilo gas roaster? Would
Right.
the results
It's very different.
transfer? And I don't know that they will.
I can't speak for that for sure because that's not how I generally roast. So um, to
Have you
me,
always oven roasted? Whether it's
I have oven roasted. I made I because I'm kind of a MacGyver too, I guess. I made a small drum roaster,
Okay.
and I didn't like it because to me it was very small, and I felt I had more control. I guess I was just more comfortable with the convection oven, and so I went back to that. And the machine can
Gotcha.
do more than one thing. I could bake it the two.
Well,
So,
I was thinking, from an Alton Brown, unitasker perspective,
yes.
if you have to make if you're in a constrained space situation and you have to make a choice,
Oh
right?
yeah, definitely.
Right. Having a convection oven means that you can roast cocoa beans, you can toast nuts, you can, if you've got a good convection oven, you can dehydrate. And then you have the ability to, I can bake brownies. And I think that, for me conceptually, I mean, if I'm thinking about teaching chocolate making at home, right, for the consumer at home, one of the things that I think would be important to try to get across was that there are many more things you can do with chocolate than just putting it into a bar,
Yes.
right? And so, what you have is this opportunity to have fun. You can engage members of the family in the whole process and learn. It's like peeling cocoa beans goes a lot faster when you have 3 people to do it rather than one,
Uh-huh.
right? And that you might make a chocolate bar this week, or next week you might make a chocolate sauce for homemade ice cream because you have an ice cream maker that somebody gave you, or you could
Make a mole sauce.
I'm sorry,
Make a mole sauce.
make a mole
Chicken. There
sauce.
you go.
And we use brownies all the time
Yes.
as something to do. But I think that for me, this notion of thinking of bean to bar chocolate is there's a tendency to think that what we're going to do is we're going to make bars from it, right? And it turns out it's chocolate. What can I do with the chocolate that I make? So I want to thank everybody who's been here. Josh, what I want to do is thank you for being here today, and to let everybody know we've been speaking with Josh Parker. I've known, again, if you were here at the very beginning, I've said I've known Josh for probably close to a decade now.
Yeah.
I met you while you were still working in Lubbock. I had the good fun of helping you start up Mahogany Chocolate and Ambergris Key in Belize. We spent a couple of days down there with the installation and commission of everything. Had a good time, and you and I have been talking about the work that you're doing in Boise, and one of the things that you've been doing to grow the business in the pandemic, and many people are faced with this in chocolate, is expanding the range of services that we offer. And so one way that you've been doing that is by offering online courses in making chocolate. And so people who are interested if you're interested in making chocolate and want an opportunity to learn more about making chocolate, not only is Josh offering this website where there is a course that you can take to learn things, but there is, in fact, a private Facebook group that you can join, and you can interact with Josh directly afterwards, and you can ask the sort of detailed, nuanced questions that you want to ask. They will go, I don't understand. Please go and help me and do that.
Yes.
And so I'm going to give people sort of a last opportunity to ask a question or two before we close this out. To remind people to please like, subscribe, share, comment. Let people know around you that of what it is that I'm doing here with the Chocolate Life Live. To give people a few more minutes to ask a question, I want to let everybody know that on Friday the 21st of January, I will have as my guest Terry Collingsworth. Terry Collingsworth is with International Rights Advocates, and IRA is the organization that filed the lawsuits against Nestle, Cargill, that went to the Supreme Court and is also in charge of the lawsuit in the DC Circuit Court, for which Nestle, Cargill, and others are named defendants. And so we'll be talking about the updates to that case, those two cases, and what's going on in the world of trying to combat child slavery in the world of cocoa and chocolate. On Friday, the 28th of January, I've got a room or a session. I don't know what to call it. The Clubhouse calls them rooms. I don't know what we're going to call these. Interviews, live streams, in which recently the USDA and the International Executive Service Corps organized two research reports. One is a global cocoa market study. The other one is a Dominican Republic country study. And I'm going to have two of the primary researchers, the primary investigators of that study, or those two studies, who are going to be here to discuss the impact of those two studies, what it means for chocolate makers and what they can learn. And then next Friday, what I'm going to be doing is an intro room to that study. So I'm going to go and do a deep dive on my own reading on these two studies. They're each like 125, 150 pages long. And I'm going to pull out things that I think are important that we want to know. There'll be links that everybody can download those studies for themselves. And then we're going to bring Mariana de la Rosa and Marika Sanford of Gaia Cacao in Amsterdam. And they're going to be talking about specific aspects of the report. So I'm really, really looking forward to that. And then to let people know that beginning in February, I'm going to be adding another day. So Fridays is going to be these live streams in which we're going to talk mostly about issues related to cocoa and chocolate. They could be political, they could be economic, social, whatever it is they're going to be. And then on Tuesdays, I'm going to be adding a series where I'm going to be focusing on talking with cocoa suppliers and chocolate makers, specifically about topics in cocoa and chocolate. And so I just wanted to let everybody know about that. These are the plans coming up in the next couple of weeks. So Josh, one last question. Thomas asks, are you working out of your home?
No, I started there. No, I'm in a commercial kitchen. So I use, to sell commercially, you have to be in a kitchen that's then inspected by the health department.
In Idaho?
In Idaho, yes. That's true.
There's no cottage food law in Idaho?
There is, and I could do that, but I couldn't wholesale. Let me rephrase that. So I have wholesale accounts, mostly wineries. That's become kind of my go-to client. So no, I work out of a commercial space.
Great. All right, and I think that wraps it up for today. I want to thank everybody for joining the Chocolate Life Live. So what is this? The first Friday of January, January 7th. And just put a note in your calendar. Go to TheChocolateLife.com, and there is a calendar of all the past Chocolate Life Live series. You can go and watch the live streams from there. You can learn about them. And as well as there's a calendar of all the upcoming live streams that have been scheduled. And so thank you very much, everybody. Have a great weekend. Josh, thank you very much for being a part of what goes on today.
Thank you, Clay. Appreciate it.